I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I'm speaking to James Basson of Scape Design. James runs his design practice along with wife Helen out of the south of France, and they're part of a design school amongst which are counted Thomas Rayner and Claudia West, James Hitchmer and Nigel Dunnett, and Olivier Philippi, a school which has become synonymous with the naturalistic style, the use of native plants, and often the implementation of matrix or grid planting to populate large areas of landscape. It was this part of James's practice that initially sparked my interest, and we get around to talking about that towards the end of the interview. But first, we cover the type of work undertaken by Scape Design and the gardens James designs for some of the most demanding environments.
We started the design practice in 2000, I think, in the south of France. I'd spent 2 years working for a guy called Ross Palmer, a Kiwi, in London, in Islington. And then we moved out here and had babies and bought a house and did all those things pretty quickly. So we had to get working pretty fast and make money. So we were doing maintenance and build. Then we did design and build and slowly developed into just a design practice. But we spent 7 years making gardens, which was a great post-school thing to do because you really learn about how things are made and how long things take and how expensive things are and all that sort of stuff. So it really helped us understand our business. And also the maintenance side, understanding what maintenance is and what a pain it is to do stuff that's really irritating, that some designs that you make end up being frustrating for gardeners. So I think we've been always quite focused on what we're putting into gardens, how they're going to be maintained. It's sort of a big part of our work. I came from landscape painting, so I've sort of got a sort of potentially different look on my take on landscape gardens is not really gardens. I've not really ever been very interested in gardens, much more interested in landscapes. I spend a lot of our time walking this amazing landscape in the south of France, in the Alps, the Alpes Maritimes, and looking at what works in the landscape and then applying that to gardens. So a lot of our work has been about translating landscape into gardens, especially the plants down here, making gardens that are sustainable so you don't need irrigation, working with the plants that grow wild naturally here and sort of all around the Mediterranean basin.
And do you work mainly in France or do you work internationally? Yeah,
most of our work's in France. Probably 75%, and the rest is show garden work, really. We seem to do about 3 show gardens a year and have been doing for the last 10 years. Probably not that many, but probably done about 20, 25 show gardens. And that's taken us all over the world, which has been really brilliant, and been very lucky to meet some fantastic designers, and you kind of get stuck with them in a hotel. So you really cross swords with them and, get to meet a whole range of people and ideas and see a whole bunch of different cultures, Japan and China and America and Singapore and all over really. So it's been really a great opportunity for us to make something creative and a little bit out of the box and less restrained by all the client considerations you have to make normally. So that's been good fun, and it got us travelling, which was good fun too.
I often wonder if somebody approached you and said, please come and do this garden in, I don't know, wherever in the world, somewhere else. Would you, because your garden design is based around a really comprehensive knowledge of landscapes and ecosystems, particularly as you say where you live and the plants and how everything works together, would you accept a commission somewhere where you weren't familiar with the planting and the terrain and all the rest of it? And if you did, how would you go about researching that project?
I think I'm not that excited by abundancy. So anything that's sort of tropical, that really doesn't float my boat. So anything that's difficult. So if the landscape's difficult for some reason or another, like dry or I'm not sure really. Dry is my main thing. Probably cold. I'm really sort of drawn towards the north, so I've probably been doing something up there. I'd be spending time in the landscape again, looking at the landscape, seeing how it works, what is the language of that landscape, and then trying to use that to sort of inspire the garden. I think if I got out of dry, then I'd be a bit, it'd take me some time to work out what plants work. Dry seems to be the place where I've had the most experience, and so I've got a good kind of backdrop of plants that I understand, and I understand how plants deal with dryness. Potentially, if I was working in bog, it'd take me a bit longer.
So obviously you need to build resilience into the gardens that you design. Do you do that with hard landscaping as much as the planting?
Yeah, well, in dry landscapes, the hard landscaping is really important because in the summer months when the clients are here, they're generally at their worst. So if the hard landscaping isn't sculptural and doesn't have its own kind of power and sense of place, then the garden generally looks pretty terrible. So it's been an important part of our practices to design and kind of use the hard landscaping to give a strong garden landscape sense already before we sort of use plants to embellish that.
How important is it to incorporate plants that are, to all intents and purposes, low maintenance or resilient in certain situations?
Well, low maintenance means doesn't mean no maintenance. Our first client was a lawyer, and he held me to the fact that I said no maintenance, and that was a disaster. And low maintenance for us means sort of artistic maintenance. What we really want now is our gardeners to work creatively in a garden instead of like the drudgery of mowing and blowing, more the sort of selective weeding, selective pruning, sculptural pruning, that kind of work, and then additional planting, moving plants, dividing plants, like the original gardening practice, which means that actually the gardens aren't really, they are kind of low drudgery, but they're not low maintenance. And I think what really makes great gardens is the maintenance. And if there's no maintenance, if there's no gardener involved, then most of our gardens just become very wild and woolly. And at that point, they kind of lose their real garden quality and become just wild.
Obviously, that's a process of ongoing editing, but when you design your landscapes, they are very naturalistic. Do you go in with any really strong design principles that underpin your work, which stops the areas that you design from completely melting into the landscape beyond? You know, where do you draw a line to separate the cultivated from the uncultivated?
I think we work with a lot of different species every time we make a garden, and so we'll pluck out the surrounding landscape plants that come from that landscape, so they sort of make sense as they roll through the garden, and then we'll bring in a whole bunch of new plants that are new to the landscape, and therefore they'll kind of flower later in the year, or they'll do something that we were interested in. And then our two sort of standard kind of rules is to create a rhythm in the garden, and we often do that with sort of drifts or bands of different plantings sort of crossing the garden, often herbaceous and grassy, and then shrubby and kind of sculpted domey. So we have this sort of strong visual rhythm across the garden. And then we also try and create a dominant, like 3 to 6 species, which are going to like dominate the whole garden, which means that the garden is readable, the vegetation is readable. Often my early gardens, they got too complicated and too messy because I had 10% of everything, and now we're trying to do 35% of 2 things, and really give a sense of dominance to something that's going to really make the garden feel like it's one whole piece of work.
And do you have kind of favourites that you use?
Yeah, I think Pistachio lentiscus is for me here at the moment, it's my sort of go-to plant because it's very boring, which means it doesn't matter if I use it over and over again because it's not very noticeable. But in midsummer, it's bright green. It's really healthy. It looks very happy. And the problem with a lot of dry gardens is they can look a bit sad midsummer, and that's when our plants are here and they can go all brown and a bit dull. And this thing is bright and glossy, and you can prune it to any shape or form. It could be a small tree, or it could be a 10 centimetre high ground cover, depending on how you maintain it. So it's a real good hanger that I put a lot of vegetation through. It's probably my real go-to at the moment.
And are you using a mixture of native and non-native plants, or are you using more of one than the other?
I would say it's 30% native, so plants that are really growing in the surrounding landscape, and the rest is Mediterranean basin. I don't really go for much South African, although South African plants are useful because they're more summer flowering, but I always find them looking a bit extraordinary in landscape, and the same with Australian plants. There's lots of Australians that will do quite well, but somehow I just think they sort of feel a bit at odds with the rest of the plants, so I try and stick to Mediterranean basin.
And is there the potential for any of those to become invasive? And if there is, how do you mitigate that?
Yeah, there is, and it's a worry with what we do. We're using a lot of Euphorbia rigida at the moment because it's a really dramatic plant and gives a real sort of sculptural, structural quality, and then it self-seeds and it flowers brilliantly, and so it's a really brilliant plant, very useful. But it is self-seeding really well, and so we are a bit nervous about that. I think our big issues are the plants that self-seed. Anything that doesn't self-seed, we're not really too worried. And those ones we have to keep an eye on, and that's back to maintenance really, keeping an eye on where they're going and how they're working. We really changed the soil to a certain degree in all of our gardens by bringing in lots of gravel, and the surrounding landscapes generally aren't that. So if a plant's really self-seeding well in our garden, it probably won't do in the rest of the surrounding landscape because it hasn't got all that added mineral quality.
Can you talk a bit about your matrix form of planting? I know that we have discussed this in the past, but yeah. Could you just touch on that and the ideas around it?
Well, I think it's, I read James Hitchmore and Nigel Dunnett produced a book called, it'll come to me in a minute, but they produced this brilliant book, and they were talking about how foresters do planting plans to the point where it's not about the garden designer saying, "Oh, I think this lavender would look perfect here," and "Oh, I think this rosemary would look perfect there," but actually putting a pattern across the landscape and just filling that with a matrix. And that matrix, it doesn't really matter where each plant turns up in the garden, because in the end you're trying to get this maybe rhythmic or strong graphic in some way, but pattern across the garden. And if the rosemary and the lavender are in the opposite positions, it doesn't really matter because you're trying to make this natural quality. And so we produce these sort of formulas that we might sort of polka dot with some sort of structure and like underplant with some sort of ground cover, but we generally like lay this matrix across the garden, varying itself when it comes to shade or comes to full sun or comes to a wetter area. So it sort of evolves, but there's this sort of pattern which gets sort of draped across the landscape, and that's really worked well for us. It also works well for speed of laying out. So gardeners, when they come to lay these gardens out, they find it easy to do because we're not too uptight about where the plants end up. And we used to do these sort of spotty plans with symbols on for every individual plant, and then the gardeners would go bonkers about trying to make that work and trying to lay it out. And in the end, they start making it up, and we couldn't tell the difference, so we realised that we just make it much more simple. And
is that based on a particular size grid? Is it like, I don't know, 2 square metres per grid that then gets repeated? Or does it vary?
I think it varies. The more, if the surface area of the garden is bigger, then we'll use more species. If we're working in a really small garden, we would still do it. We'd probably reduce the amount of species so it doesn't get too busy. And again, we'd make sure that we've got like some dominant vegetation so it doesn't look too sort of brown. We want to give it sort of highlight.
And would you say that there is kind of a lower and an upper limit as to how many species you would include in one of those grids?
We're working on that at the moment, and I wouldn't want to go below 5 different species. So I guess if you've got 5 square meters, 5 plants square meter, 25 plants, I think 5 would be my minimum. Otherwise, of course you could just do some monoculture of lavender, and I guess that's got its value, so it's not like it's wrong. But I think we would do minimum 5 and maximum. Well, I guess it depends on the size of the area. If it becomes huge, if you have a couple of hundred, I think that would be fine, as long as there's real dominance. There's a real kind of 30% of something which is really strong, so that it doesn't become just too messy. And
then presumably you put that together based on how those plants will interact with each other and how the root systems would develop and all the rest of it. Is that right?
Yeah, we're working on that. I mean, that is the holy grail for me at the moment. We've sort of been looking at into ecology studies, the CSR model, which James and Nigel will talk about this sort of competitivity and values their different plants and their different mechanisms for proliferating. Also, Claudia West and Thomas Rayner's work is fantastic, and they've sort of pulled out of ecology as well. They've pulled out the fact that some plants proliferate by self-seeding, so you often spot them through a landscape, and some plants through running, so you kind of group them through a landscape. And so there's these patterns of laying plants out relative to how they will grow in a landscape. And so we're sort of kind of accumulating all that information at the moment to try and produce solutions that are long-lasting and will evolve and initially look right in the landscape when we lay them out, and then evolve in a communal way.
And when you say we're collecting that, is that you in your design studio? Yeah.
Well, with our design studio sort of getting a little bit bigger in a consultant kind of fashion, because we're working with a brilliant girl who's sort of an analyst and database miner and sort of a real geek, and then another geek who is a computer programmer. So we've come along with our knowledge, which is quite horticultural and sort of lacking that real, as far as I'm concerned, the real heart of the subject is ecology and botany, and seeing plants in their natural environment. It's all very well all this information we get from websites which have seen plants grow in the garden environment, but the garden environment is a wholesome soil with wholesome amount of water and a wholesome amount of sun, and everything's kind of perfect. And so the plant grows in a very different way to how it would grow in the wild. And so it almost doesn't have to fight to survive. It gets gardened to survive. And we want to see how plants work in the natural environment, because then they have to fight to survive. And they're the plants that you can, that's the understanding you need to sort of create systems which will evolve as a community.
So that sounds like a massive undertaking. Are you using your observation and your knowledge to input into that database? Yeah. So a lot of initially it's a lot of trawling the internet, trying to find sources and information. There's Pignati and someone else, 2 Italians who did this amazing study of the whole of the Italian flora in the wild. And they graded every single variable that they thought was relevant to how they manage in the wild. And so
we sort of use that data crossed with other data from other ecologists, other botanists. So we're sort of getting this proven data as far as the academic world is concerned. And then I'm throwing in my own understanding, and also potentially I'm dragging that up and down in this big spreadsheet. So once I've understood that Achillea millefolium behaves in a certain way, then Achillea millefolium cerise queen, or whatever it's going to be called, will probably behave in the same way. So I'm sort of spreading that information and doing some guesstimating to see how these things would evolve in England.
And are you doing that based just on your region?
I think I'm sort of taking the understanding that I've understood from my region. So if Lavandula angustifolia vulgate behaves in one way, then Angustifolia pigtop blue will behave in a similar way. If I've understood that, then I can pretty much guesstimate that every Achillea millefolium will behave in the same way, even if it's not from my region, even if it's from the north. You know? At some point, plant behavior is species specific. It may not be, it's genera and species specific, but probably not cultivar specific. At the point of cultivar, then most things behave in a similar way.
You would get the database of plants and know how they behave, and then presumably you would input the data from a garden and things like soil, moisture content, sun, all the rest of it. Would you then plug that in and see what kind of gelled?
Yeah, so at the moment we're working with a database called Soil Grids, which is sort of fuzzy data to a degree. It's sort of an assessment of the world's soils and climate, and it sort of amalgamated a lot of information and come up with best guess situation for every site around the world. And then we cross-reference that with our knowledge of a specific site. So it'll say, okay, your soil is this, and if we don't like that completely, we'll nudge it up and down to make sure it feels about right. Then we produce a list of plants that are most likely to survive in that landscape. And then we rework that list until we get something which also suits the kind of look of the garden we're trying to design.
So effectively, if that database works and gets rolled out, I guess will you maybe be eliminating the need for garden designers?
Well, I guess it's the same debate as whether Google got rid of libraries. Initially we used to go to libraries to do our research, and it used to take us 2 weeks. Now we use Google, and it takes us 2 hours, and this instead will take 2 minutes. But it's the same kind of information, just reprocessed to make it quicker and easier for designers to use. It's not removing that information, or you can go back into that information and spend hours going back into the books, or hours sort of trawling the internet, or you can spend a couple of minutes looking at the results produced by a database which has used all that information. And if you're not sure about it, you can go back and double check yourself. So it's just a sort of a speed thing more than a eradication thing. And so designers, we're all trying to work to a budget and a timeline. The idea is it just helps them work faster.
So it doesn't actually churn out the matrix plan as a done deal?
Well, there's sort of, we're thinking that maybe there's a few kind of levels. No designer is going to want to work with something that tells them what plants they should choose. But they are going to be really pleased if we give them a list of plants that would really work, and they're working in to their aesthetic choice, like the colors are right, or the shapes are right, or the transparency is right, or whatever they're after. And if we give them a list of 20 plants that they can choose from, they're going to love that, because they've got a problem, like me, that they really love all plants, probably, and then they've got 200 that they want to use, but we're going to say, well, actually only 20 would work. So you choose out the 20. So that's for designers, we think that's the way to work. We give them a bunch of lists that they choose from, but those lists are much shorter than the RHS Plant Finder guide. And then for punters, for clients who can't afford a garden designer or want to have a go themselves, then we potentially could produce a list of plants that that are sort of pre-selected. And so, then at that point, the designer's role is not necessary, not needed, and those clients are there anyway. So I don't think it's replacing them. I think it's just helping clients who can't afford a designer or want to have a go themselves make their own decisions or make their own gardens without us.
And is the idea that it would eventually tie up to nurseries so that you could just effectively go, okay, well, I've got this database of plants. I want to know the availability. Okay, I can see that I like those 5 choices. They're available. I can get them delivered. And so it's kind of like a, beginning to end system.
Yeah, ideally, it'd be nice to have another level to it and that nurseries are involved. And so the list produces only plants that are available. Another thing that us designers have a real issue with is we spend hours making these plant lists and we get really seduced by this lovely planting design we've come up with, and then we can't find the plants, and it's super frustrating. Or we have to find the plants from 5 nurseries, and that takes days, and we lose money and time, and it's a real, very frustrating part of the planting design process. And so if we were connected to a whole bunch of nurseries, you could select that you only want them from a local nursery. So we deal with that issue of carbon footprint of finding plants from too far away, or we find one nursery that produces all the plants, and therefore you don't have to shop around in many different nurseries. So there's potentially a tie-on to that. But initially, what we're really, really excited about is kind of dealing with that madly complex problem of planting design, which is the soil plus the weather plus the client's choices plus the designer's choices plus the. So it just becomes this massive mathematical, ecological debate which takes forever. And designers often are artists, but potentially not ecologists or botanists or horticulturalists. They've got one feather to their arrow, not 20, and so is it arrow to their quiver or whatever that is. But we're expected to understand a lot of different things and all spend hours and hours but not be able to charge for it. So, or produce the same planting list for everybody, because then we don't have to bother our heads too much about it. So this is just a tool, really, just another way of managing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're aiming to be the Sergey Brin of the planting world. When will this go live, or when would you like it to go live? Do you have any ideas?
We'd like to produce the database and the initial database and the initial kind of list format for designers. We'd like that to come out this summer. It won't be perfect, but we think it's better to get it out there and start sort of sharing that. We want it to be a free online service that designers can go online and use and produce plant lists, and we really want their feedback to understand whether it's a goer, really, whether it's producing plants lists that people are interested in, if there's things we haven't really thought about, and to try and sort of improve that. But that initial, 200-day piece of work we put in, we want to give it out free so that people can have a go and see if it works, and see if people get excited about it, and see if it's something that people would use. Cool.
Well, when it goes live, will you let me know, and then I can let everyone who's listening know?
All right, we'll do. Sure thing.
So watch this space. Thank you very much to James for sharing an insight into his work and for talking about his new project. Personally, I find the advancement of technocracy into an arena such as landscape design quite scary, but I find it hard to articulate quite why without resorting to ethereal and abstract concepts. One book that deals with this issue is Charles Eisenstein's Climate: A New Story, which is an interesting read and does exactly what it says on the tin. Taking a reductionist approach to plants and landscape seems almost inevitable if we continue along our current path, but I can't help resenting it. Maybe it's a simple fear of the unknown and resistance to change, or maybe we should listen to our instincts even if we can't fully justify why. As always, a huge thanks to you two for listening, and I won't catch you next Tuesday because from now on the podcast will be released on a Monday. And as of next week, there'll also be an additional segment at the end of each interview too, which I hope you'll enjoy. So catch you in 6 days. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.